So the official definition of ADHD is I sadly lost my friend who took his own life. What I love to do with my clients is to start getting them to
How do you think tech impacts ADHD people?
the people that have ADHD and have now mobile phones. Gaming is a huge one that I get a lot of teenagers, parents come to with their teenagers. It's having a massive impact.
What would we call them? Okay, on the show today, ADHD coach, yoga teacher, I'm told ex-football hooligan too, so I want to get into that. Someone I'm already a bit in love with from listening to her podcast. I've learned loads about ADHD from it myself. And I think this will apply, anyone who's a yoga teacher needs to hear from this in case they've got ADHD students. For coaches, going to learn a lot if they've got, coaching people with ADHD. And I think we're going to have fun too. So Rosie, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. We're very excited to be here.
We're going to have a good time. What is ADHD? Let's dive in.
So the official definition of ADHD is attention hyperactivity. Oh, sorry. I do this all the time. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. However, ADHD is a difference, is how I like to view it. So a neurological difference, which basically means our brains are wired different. So we tend to think in non-linear ways. We have a 30% delay in our executive function, and we have an interest-based nervous system. So there is a lot of activity, it's said, in our dopamine levels. So it's yet to be decided if we don't gain as much dopamine when we get a dopamine hit, or if the levels just drop a lot quicker. So we find it more difficult to retain dopamine.
But I want to come back to dopamine. That's brilliant. So this is me listening to a podcast. Oh, boring. I've got to do a podcast. Oh, I can't bother. Leave it to the last minute. Oh, wow. This is amazing. I'm now going to binge watch all of Rosie's podcasts she's ever done and be hyper fixated on it all yesterday and today and get madly obsessed. That is pre-ADHD, right, Rosie? Fair to say?
That's called hyper focused.
I love it. I have an official diagnosis, by the way, and for the last few years, I did what I'm told a lot of middle-aged women do. I went with my niece. Often it's people's children, and I said, and she was getting a diagnosis, and I looked through it, and she was like, "Uncle Mark, you've got all of these," and I was like, "Oh, okay." And I got a test done to make her feel better, but then it's also made my life easier. So we'll come to that.
Very interesting.
Is it a disorder? Or is it a difference? So it's called disorder. Sometimes I want to call it awesome non-deficit hyperactivity stuff. Squirrel Club, I also call it. Is it a disorder? Is it a disease? Or is it just like, hey, we're wired a bit differently and that's got pros and cons? Where do you stand on that?
So I definitely don't like to frame it as a disorder because I definitely think it's just a difference. However, there's the people will argue on disability versus difference. And where I sit on that is I think ADHD can very much be both a struggle and a strength. It can feel very disabling at times. However, the only reason that I view my own ADHD as disabling is a lot to do with how, the world is set up. It's set up for normative standards. So the things that we might find difficult, like sitting still in a classroom to learn, for instance, we only find difficult because our brains are wired differently. And I can educate and have educated myself on my morning walks for the last 10 years and have learned so much more doing that with audiobooks where I couldn't do that in the classroom. So you see, so that's where I sit. I think it will always be a bit of both, but I think the large majority of that is because of, how the world's set up. And what I love to do with my clients is to start getting them to, have authentic approach to managing their ADHD. And that starts with doing things differently. Stop trying to do things like a neurotypical, because that's where we're coming stuck.
Great. We'll definitely get onto some practical tips that coaches can pass on, or if people are listening. What would we call the normies then? Let's say ADHD people run the world. We're living in squirrel world now, right? We run the world. And there's 1 in 10 people's born with non-ADHD. Would it be called like sloth, boring, non-creative disorder? What would we call it if we're pathologizing normotypicals?
Well, I mean, some people go vanilla, or I don't. I think. Well, I think not. I suppose typical doesn't sound like a very,
But if
very
they were atypical,
interesting.
what would we call them?
Mm,
Do you see what I mean?
yeah,
All right. So
they're
what are the
just
advanced
normal. What is
normies? But they
normal?
wouldn't be normies.
What is
They would be the
normal?
opposite. Be like, why do you focus on one thing all day long? So, mate,
How?
how do you do that, you weirdo? So, there's a few parts to it, right? So, some people are more hyperactive, like me. I tend to jump around. Some people can't focus so much. Just
Hmm.
listening to Mike Israetel talk about his story. He's a big YouTuber who works with fitness. We had on the podcast, and he tells his story, and his was completely unable to focus in school, for example.
Mm.
And what are some of the main kind of strengths and weaknesses that ADHD people tend to have? Let's go for both sides.
Let's go for both sides. So, shall I start? I'll start in a place of strength, actually. So, what we see tends to be the strength, the common strengths. Obviously, everyone is individual. We have to always say that because, when you've met one person, you've met one person with ADHD. But what we tend to see is creative, problem solvers, definitely problem solvers, resilience. And I think that probably comes a lot from, spending years masking and feeling like you're being, knocked down time and time again and learning ways to keep bringing yourself back all the time. We see passion, zest for life. I think when we're really into something, you don't see anybody run with something so fast with so much passion and talk about it and so much passion and turn it around in, a few weeks when they've had an idea like you do an ADHDer. When it comes to our, I say, the struggles that we face, um, working memory is part of that. So we do suffer with something called time blindness. And that can mean we just have no concept of, time. So we could lose ourselves in a piece of work that was meant to be 5 minutes, do a few emails, and next thing you know, it's been 6 hours and we've lost track of time. Um, we can misjudge how long things are going to take us. So transitions and things like that are quite difficult for us. Um, Also, that dopamine, lack of dopamine, we struggle with addiction and extreme behaviors. Um, so we are said to take up between we are meant, I'm losing my words. We are said to be 5 to 10 times more likely to have a problem with substance abuse than those about. So I think that's one of the biggest struggles and weaknesses we face, and especially in environments, in the world that we live in at the moment, where we've got technology, gambling at people's fingertips, social
Right.
media, and all that kind of stuff. But one of the biggest struggles that you'll hear an ADHD talk about is something called RSD, and this is emotional part of the emotional dysregulation, and it's called rejection sensitive dysphoria. Now, this is paranoia, imposter syndrome, all mixed into one. And we tend to be overly sensitive to perceived or real rejection. And it can completely floor us for, like as if the world is going to end and if something bad is really going to happen. Great example is if you work in an office environment or you work for someone in a business and your boss has sent you an email or a meeting request to say quick catch up. Many ADHDers will assume all night, go home that night and assume they're going to get fired the next day, not sleep, go into complete panic and overthink it, when it was literally just a catch up. So that's one of the biggest struggles. And every ADHD you meet will say that's probably the worst thing about living with ADHD is that oversensitivity. However, the flip side of that is we tend to be really empathetic and really understanding people. And it's very rare that I get a client that isn't in a service-based job of some sort, helping others.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
The RSD one was new for me. I heard you mention that in an interview when I was prepping, and I had to look it up. And then I was like, I don't have that. And then I was talking to my girlfriend, and she said, yeah, but that cancellation attempt you had was really painful for you. And she said, and you sometimes get a bit paranoid that people in work aren't, doing this and there's a manager. And I was like, oh, yeah. So it's maybe a slightly male version of it, but that
Mm,
resonated with me. It,
yeah.
is there a risk that people overdiagnose. So it used to be when I was a kid, I look back and I think there was kids that definitely had it that weren't diagnosed, myself included. We were just told we were naughty, we couldn't sit still, we're sort of, pathologized for not being able to sit still. And I remember there was some teachers that would let me go for a walk in the middle of class who had sort of worked it out without knowing the official terminology. But my niece has a much better time in school than I did because they're diagnosing it.
Mm.
But then on the other hand, there seems to be, particularly amongst the younger generation, a trend of saying you have autism, ADHD, various kind of trauma things, which maybe we'll come to that. Is there a risk of the risks of under and over diagnosis? Please talk about that.
I would say we don't have a problem with overdiagnosis. I think it can seem like that at the moment because, it was only in 2013 that we found out that you could have autism and ADHD together. So already, if people were diagnosed with ADHD when they were younger, they would never have been tested for autism because it was said that it wasn't combined. 2008 was when we first were allowed to diagnose or realized that adults could have ADHD and it didn't just disappear. So what we actually have, it feels like lots of people are getting diagnosed, but actually we've got a backlog of people that were wiped out and said they didn't have it. And the reason being as well, as you talked about the different types earlier, what we didn't understand and what the world didn't understand, even myself until I got diagnosed, is, you got the external hyperactivity and the naughty schoolboy that was quite well known. What people didn't know is the inattentive type, which was previously known as ADD, and is said to be prominently women that get diagnosed with this type. However, there's combined where you can have both. And that's like takes up 50% of the diagnosis. And that's what I have. And that is all internalized hyperactivity. So you won't see them externally jumping around the room or, having to move and pace up and down and talk really fast all the time. That's all going on internally. And it can be the daydreamer in the classroom, someone that forgets and misplaces their belongings, for instance. So the reason I believe it feels like to everybody, everyone's getting diagnosed with ADHD, is because we have a huge amount of information now. Or I say huge, there's still a lot more to come out.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
from what we did have, so we're playing catch up. And
Yeah. Makes sense.
yeah, that's what I've.
It's hard on the NHS as well, isn't it? I got a private diagnosis in the end, but the NHS is like backlogs 2-3 years. It's rubbish, isn't it? In terms
Well,
of actually
yeah,
trying
it's
to go
actually
through the
8 to
system.
10 years at the moment.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh my God. That is so there is sort of a class thing here as well, isn't there? Of people that can afford. So there's a gender piece that a lot of girls were being missed, I think, in this, right? Because we had a
Mm.
certain image of what it was. And as you said, I've also just learned this term from you, internalized ADHD, the sort of maybe the over warrior, the perfectionist, the bouncing around their own head rather than bouncing around the room, right? Is that
Mm.
a fair way of saying that?
100%. And actually, when you said about RSD earlier, I wanted to say then is that perfectionism that you spoke about, RSD can actually show up like that in your work as well. So that fear of being rejected can even happen in those areas. And that's a very internalized part of ADHD that people wouldn't see.
And the other thing is the tech. I was just prepping for this. I was talking to my girlfriend saying, you know what, I managed it pretty well at school, even though I didn't have a name for it. I knew I needed, my mum could give me a lot of swimming lessons and exercise, and I sort of burnt off some of the energy that way. And I had some good teachers that made what I'd call accommodation, this idea of accommodate reasonable. Like one teacher literally would let me go for a walk in the middle of an hour-long class, and I'd always be back in
Wow.
5 minutes and would work. And I always did well in that class. And that teacher had just figured out that's what I needed to do. And I'd get the work done. I just needed to get up in the middle of the hour. I still don't like sitting down for more than an hour.
No, same.
So I'd sort of worked things out the hard way a little bit and been quite lucky in a way. And one way I think I was lucky is that I didn't have a mobile phone. So
Mm.
I am old as fuck, and I didn't grow up with a mobile. So now like I'm caught on it. I'll be caught on gambling things like crypto stuff, games, social media. I've now taken off my phone because I found it was really doing my head in. I get addicted to checking my YouTube stats now. It's a new thing every week. It's a new little addiction or every month or two on my phone. How do you think tech impacts ADHD people?
Hugely. So this is the part of the debate I think that everyone believes is causing ADHD. I think it can cause ADHD-like symptoms for some people, but the people that have ADHD and have now mobile phones, gaming is a huge one that I get a lot of teenagers, parents come to me with their teenagers. It's having a massive impact because it is constant dopamine. And as you know, not healthy dopamine for us. People getting up first thing in the morning, I'm hearing vapes and they check their phone. And that is just going to start someone with ADHD off in
Sorry to
a
interrupt. When you
more,
say dopamine, you talk about sort of, for those that don't know, the kind of motivational
yeah,
transmitters,
the reward, yeah. So
reward
the
system.
reward hormone, and so basically, if you've got, you can tell the difference between years ago, as you all know, and I'm sure lots of your listeners might be aware. But obviously, with dopamine, it was to work for dopamine. We had to work to get dopamine. So to get our food, to get ready for the day, or whatever it is that we were doing. And now we're getting our dopamine without having to leave our bedroom or even get out of bed and get ready. So if someone with ADHD already has lower levels of dopamine and they are picking up that phone in the morning and smoking on a vape, for instance, and they're not working for that dopamine, it's a completely different hit. It's that reward constantly. And then we're getting dopamine depletion. So they're constantly all day looking for more and more and more of it. Um, so that's where the danger is with the screens. And I think that's what's making a lot of people's ADHD a lot worse and the traits a lot worse. Which is why I think, morning routines and working with the foundations of that is really extremely important for someone with ADHD to get that right hit of dopamine and healthy hit of dopamine in the morning.
I said this the other day to a bunch of people. I said, "You're all like me now, in that everyone's a bit ADHD because of the tech, but the ADHD people are worse because of the tech." That's my sense.
Mm,
It's like everyone's got a bit ADHD, but in terms of like concentration spans. Or I took a kid to the gym the other day, and we were between sets. So he was 14 years old, and we did a set of like 10 or 12 on the strength machine, and then you have to wait a couple of minutes before you do the next set. And I'd asked him not to use his phone, and he was just looking around like he didn't know what to do with that 2 minutes in between. I was like, just
yeah.
rest, mate. Just chill for 2 minutes. Then we'll do another one. And he was just like, what do I do? What do I do? And you could see him almost like his fingers were kind of itching to get his phone out. And I was like, but we'd already
Yeah.
agreed not to. So it does seem like it's a bit endemic, but I can see how people that are wired differently will have that worse, basically, is what I hear you saying.
Yeah, and also you've got to think as well, it's like a stimming as well, having something in your hand. So again, going back to vapes, because this is another thing I hear so much in the community, it's that other thing of having something to do with movement as well, having something in your hands, always doing. I don't know about you, but I have to have stuff in my hands all the
Yeah,
time.
I'll be constantly playing with a pen like that. Constant. You know what? I was going to make a joke there. My girlfriend says, "What?" But let's not. Let's not. Uh, I'm rude. I should have warned you, Rosie. So that is one of the things that's got me in trouble for ADHD. Is I've only just learned to like not make the joke, like inhibition of being disinhibited. Just, and this is what can make me funny. It's what can make me super creative. I've got loads of good
Mm,
ideas for the business, but I just say what's on my mind, and this has got me in loads of trouble. The other one that I've learned from researching this podcast, which has been great, is about relationships. So
mm,
I was, when I was, until a few years ago, I put this gently, a bit of a man whore. And the reason was I always wanted something new, something stimulating, a new date, new excitement. And that was really bad for like breaking up with good girls and long-term relationships and being addictive around it. Like that is a real, so it sounds like, oh yeah, you're not very inhibited, that it's not a big deal, but that can lead to, in my experience, real problems.
oh, huge problems. ADHD in relationships is a huge topic. And I always say it's like we're chase toxic love, train wrecks, we call them, and getting bored in the mundane, right? And we know that loneliness, we're in like a loneliness pandemic, everyone's talking about now, but we know that that can cause, can be detrimental to someone's health and life and the well-being of their life. And if you think about that, like what you've said, it's, that dopamine chasing. So we are the percentage, and I don't have the exact stats, but I interviewed someone the other day and they were saying we've got the high percentage of divorce, high percent of, cheating comes into that because obviously it's a dopamine hit. Um, and we struggle unless we have partners that can understand, or there's ways that we have awareness of how our ADHD is showing up and what is actually going on. Yeah, we can really, really struggle in that area of our lives in relationships. And that's something that's really truly showed up in my life the most, I think, is relationships. And not even just romantic ones. I think, as a community, you will hear time and time again that people with ADHD, a lot of them can make friends quite quickly, but maintaining friendships can be really, really hard.
I've lost a lot of friends over the years. I don't think I'm a bad person, but I am impulsive and I will say things I regret and wish I could
Mm,
take back. And you can't unsay something, is what I've learned as a friend and a manager. You can't just apologize for everything the next day. That's my experience,
mm.
and my team are pretty good with me, and I've learned to delegate. For example, I always say every ADHD person needs a German. I have Germans in charge of my courses who organize things beautifully,
I need
and
a
I
few of those, please.
yeah, I'll lend you some Germans and Hungarians. They're great. They're great. Everyone needs a German in their life. So, but joking aside, I know that certain things aren't my strength. My girlfriend says I should have a subscription to hats because I have a certain hat that I like, but I lose it about once a month. So she just says I should actually have a subscription. So once a month, I just get a new hat delivered because I'm
Yeah.
always losing them. When it comes to hats, it doesn't matter. But there are bigger mistakes you can make than losing your hat. I mean, jokes aside, this stuff can be quite painful, right?
Yeah, it can. And I think, you know, before I even knew I had ADHD, I'd literally couldn't leave a room, a studio, a friend's house, anywhere I went, I'd leave something behind. It just became a thing that someone would ring me or I'd have to ring them and go back. And I think what people don't see, on the outside, especially as a woman, you're called scatty, blonde, a bit of a bimbo, and all of this stuff. And that can be, again, the limiting beliefs and the self doubt starts. Um, but it's really cuts deep and it can be really frustrating and makes you believe that you're just stupid. Why
Yeah.
can't I hold on to my belongings? Why can't I, you know, remember my keys? Why have I got off at the wrong station again? Um, and I actually remember I was with a partner once and I was like this all the time. And because I'd had nothing in place either, I had no foundations, I didn't realize that I needed structure to thrive. And he said, "How would you ever be a mother? You can't even hold on to your
Wow.
belongings, or and that's." But it sounds dramatic, but you do start to think to yourself, "How will I ever?
Yeah,
How
yeah.
could I do? How could I go for that job? How could I go and have become a mum? How can I go and do these things if I can't do the small things?" And I think that's the biggest struggle I always say that we face overall is we are rife. It is rife in our community. We have a low, low, low self-esteem and lack of
Yeah.
confidence.
Yeah, for
Completely.
sure. And I've definitely spoke to people that were called stupid in school,
Mm,
that messed up their first relationships. There's all sorts of ways. For me, it was as a business person losing a load of money, going, oh
mm,
God, I wasn't responsible there. I'm a bad business person, rather than, okay, I need different structures and systems in my business. That's what I've learned. I need to work with people who can hold me to account once a week and say, right, this is the ins and outgoings. This is what we're spending money on. So I don't just, money would be another one we haven't talked about, right? I mean,
gosh,
along with
huge.
sex, that's a big killer, isn't it? Like, oh,
Yeah.
where's my people? Someone said to me that you're great at gaining money, you're great at making money, but you don't seem to ever have any. And I'm like, it just goes. Where does it go?
There you go. That should be the ADHD diagnosis. I honestly believe it's like we can make money, but keeping it is a whole other story. And it's almost like we don't care for it in a sense that like we enjoy it, we can make it and we can, motivate ourselves to do that. But the actual, concept of money and keeping it and, having that healthy relationship with it doesn't interest us. And impulsive spending is massive. And people don't want to talk about it. It's the subject. They'd rather talk about their sex lives and what's happening in their
Money's more taboo than
relationships.
sex, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like sex is, we're getting kind of cool with that, and we can say, oh, I used to have addictive issues, or I've had ex-boyfriends. It's always the ex. It's always I used to be bad, but now I'm fine.
Yeah.
But as the black with all the influencers. I used to be great. It's every TED talk you ever heard, isn't it? It's like I had a problem, but now I'm fine. And if you give me some money, you can be
Yeah.
fine like me.
What are you like with returning stuff?
What I generally wouldn't. I just forget it. But
Yeah.
yeah, I'm got good with time though, and I noticed you were bang on time today. I made the joke when you turned. I said I thought I had 5 more minutes till you'd turn up. I was still prepping. What I tend to do though, for example, on a podcast, is I'll suddenly realize I've got a podcast in 5 minutes, and I'll rush to the loo, rush to get a coffee, look at my
Yeah.
notes, and if I'd have just given it 5 more minutes, I would have been so much more chilled. As an example, so I'm not late, but I do get that sort of like rushing around
I've got to
thing.
go and do. Yeah, I do that too. Quickly make a
Losing
cup of tea.
stuff, addictive issues.
But that's the paradoxical traits though, because as well, I think some of us, even if we didn't know, we're so obsessed with thinking we're going to be late that sometimes we'll be really, really early as well. You know,
Yeah, I'm
like that,
always
that,
2 hours early for a flight. I've never missed a flight. I'm always
yeah,
well early for a flight. The taxi driver's like, "When's your flight?" You know, you could have left it another hour, or at least 2 hours early. But
yeah.
let's talk about trauma. So, the ever popular Gabor Mate talks. You know, he seems to think that all ADHD is trauma. I'm not
Hmm.
sure if I'm misquoting you on that, but it certainly is kind of a crossover. There's a bit of a Venn diagram, right? And trauma hyperarousal symptoms have a lot in common with ADHD. So what's your take on that? Are they separate? Are they crossed over? Are they the same thing? What's your take?
Well, I actually went to see him talk not long ago, and I think it's a very interesting point. Obviously, I'm not a scientist and don't have the ability to have the answers, but I'm yet to meet someone with ADHD that hasn't had some kind of trauma, right? So, obviously, there's big T's, they call it little T's, but I think it's a very interesting point of view. Whether it's caused by it, who knows? But I think it's definitely interlinked in a big way. And untangling that um, is what, the future. How we untangle that is to be confirmed. I think, because how
They to be
how
determined.
can
We're
we?
not sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
how
could
can
be
we?
there's some connection. I mean, every client. I mean, you coach a lot of people, so that says
Yeah,
something that
there's
every
something.
single client has some trauma. And
Yeah,
I noticed when I treated my trauma, my ADHD got a lot better. People would say, "Oh, you're calmer, you're easier to be around," and still got a lot of energy, kind of thing. Still got a lot of creativity, but it certainly made it way more manageable for me and others.
yeah. And a friend of mine called Winford Dorr, and I don't know if you've got to his episode yet, but I'm really work closely with him, and he has, he's done a lot of research on ADHD and trauma, and he created like an app to train our cerebellum,
Wow.
and alongside that you have some EMDR therapy. And he believes if we can it's getting ADHDers to do that, because it's a 90-day program, and I'm doing it at the moment. It's the longest I've done it now. I'm nearly 2 months in, and he truly believes that you need to, work with both, and that there is a huge connection, and that you cannot deal with one without the other. So
So
that's his view.
makes sense. Yeah. One of the things that helped me a lot was martial arts. And I know
Mm-hmm.
for you, and then yoga and dance later on. If I don't move, I'm crazy. I
Mm-hmm.
very need to move vigorously, if not every day, every couple of days. You discovered yoga, right? And became a yoga teacher. So as this is the Embodiment Coaching Podcast, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I spent, most of my life chasing wrong, unhealthy dopamine. So drugs, drink, like relationships and all sorts. And I sadly lost my friend who took his own life during that period of my life. And he had signed me up to the London Marathon as a joke. And because I literally know there was no way I was running a marathon. I was so unfit. I was smoking like 20 Marlboro Light a day, and just wasn't a marathon kind of girl. And when he passed, I obviously it just held a different meaning, and I was like, I'm going to do this. I said to my sister, I feel like I have to. And she came with me, and I trained, a bit for the marathon, not as much as other people, but I started to train, and this implement of exercise started to change things for me. And I started just to have a bit of clarity. I was still misplacing my belongings and still drinking, but not as much, and making slightly better decisions in my life. And when it ended, I was like, I need to keep this up. I need to do something. And it was yoga that I found. And that just transformed everything. I don't think I'd ever paused in my entire life, or managed to get my nervous system to a baseline before that day. And ever since, for over 10 years now, um, I have moved every single morning. I reckon I've
Mm.
had like a handful of times that I haven't done something. Um, and it has completely transformed my life. I was an addict before that. I was chaotic in ways that were just so detrimental to me and everyone around me. Um, and then teaching the practice, obviously being ADHD, after like 8 months of doing yoga, I was like, I'm going to go and become a teacher, and started sharing it with people. And I was doing it in a way that just worked for me. And you know, people said I couldn't be a yoga teacher because I was common. and I wasn't spiritual enough and I wasn't calm enough, and I still went and done it. And I think it worked because people came and felt like it wasn't, this cliquey environment or a scary environment that they couldn't be part of, despite, never stepping on a mat. So I used to do things like Club Classics yoga at first, and um, you know, I used to just call them all, different names and things that felt more approachable instead of just like Ashtanga or Hatha. And it just it completely transformed my entire life moving. And I think that movement, well, we know movement is as, if not more effective than ADHD medication for people.
For me, for my mental health, it's absolutely vital. And I have to kind of go up to go down sometimes, if that makes sense. So I have to dance or do strong yoga or do martial arts, and then I can relax. And I remember some of the first yoga classes I did, and I was in Shavasana. I was like, wow, I'm actually peaceful.
Yeah.
I'm actually chill now.
Yeah, exactly. And it's mad, isn't it? And that's, if you think about it, that's what the medication is made to do, speed people up to slow them down. If you can do that with exercise alongside it, it's amazing. And yeah, I was same as you. I got to Shavasana and I think I cried for the first year every single class because I don't think I'd ever tapped into, internally asked myself any of those questions or become aware of who I was until that moment. And that's another thing of ADHD. I think a lot of it is finding ways to manage our nervous system because it's highly sensitive. And I think that's why yoga and mindful practices work so well.
It's essentially nervous system regulation is everyone needs it, particularly in the modern world. But I think ADHD people learn like, oh, I need this lesson. I'm going to start making bad choices very quickly. And like
Yeah,
for me, like nature connection would be another. I think of it as food groups. I have
exactly.
my stillness, I have my movement, I have my co-regulation, sociability, good relationships, and then nature. And if I'm
Yeah.
not in nature every day, I go, I don't know how you live in London, but whenever I go teach in London, it sends me nuts. I actually moved to the countryside from Brighton because I was like, this is just the best thing for my nervous system. So, how do you
Yeah.
manage that?
Well, I'm in nature every morning too. So where I live is
It's the
right
fuck.
next to a park and a
Great.
forest. So I literally do that every day. But I think you're right. Like nature and movement for ADHD it's like, my big dream is to eventually be able to offer like retreats that are paid for by other people, like sponsorship or corporate companies that can actually give people with ADHD the opportunity that might not have had it, the chance to go on a retreat, move, be in nature, and have all access to all of this stuff that they can, tools that they can take with them forever. Because I think the thing with people, a lot of clients that come to me at first, it's the thought of meditation or the thought of even
Yeah,
finding
too
a
much.
routine. Oh my God, they want to scream and run away, like it's not for me. And if people like, you've described how your ADHD showed up, you was very, can't stop, won't stop ADHD, or like myself, we know that if it's possible for us, it's possible for them. And I think that's part of what the mission is for me, and I think for many other people out there in the community, to get more ADHDers and managing the nervous system and being
You,
able to
you
do that.
you help yoga teachers, and obviously we've got a lot of coaches listening to this, and you do trainings for yoga teachers.
Mm.
So for me, for example, doing in a normal yoga class was sometimes quite difficult. I mean, my first retreat, which no one told me was a silent retreat, and I was used to co-regulating through yattering. Yeah,
God,
I was like, what do you mean silent for 4 days? I was like, I'm fucking Irish and ADHD.
you
You
went
haven't told
straight in.
me. I was bouncing off. I was like hugging everyone, and I was like, this is, I literally had all my co-regulation taken away. And they just thought I was insane. But I think had they been a bit more sort of ADHD informed in the same way as you can be trauma informed as a yoga teacher, right? They would have
Mm.
been a bit more like, okay, we get what's going on here. This guy's used to sort of socially co-regulating in a hyperactive manner. So for the coaches, the yoga teachers listening, how can they be a little bit more ADHD informed? What are some of the things they might want to give that accommodation to?
I think one of the things I always say as well is just understanding that ADHD might be showing up. So if someone's not, because I know a lot of teachers have said to me, "Oh, I get really frustrated, like they're not doing what I've said they're going to do, like what I've opposed that I've said in the way I've said it." I think remembering that with ADHD, that they might just not, the person might have ADHD, they might have lost concentration, or that yogi's choice. Sometimes for me, I would do more in a pose if I had extra energy, like I wanted to do, go a bit further one day or something like that. And a lot is, frowned upon sometimes. But letting people have a bit of freedom within the
Mm.
practice, I think. And I don't mean to say, oh yeah, let's just let everyone just run around and do what they want. But I think flexible structure, I always say, and just letting go of judgment and maybe choosing, which most yoga teachers are, quite just understanding and maybe being a bit more curious. Um, and I think, empowering language is always really important. As we've mentioned, RSD, that doesn't disappear on the mat either. So I think being quite conscious and intentional with our language is really, really important. Um, and there's a thing called demand avoidance. I don't know if you've heard of it, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah. I have an autistic partner, and anytime I asked her to do anything, she'd hear it as a demand and get really stressed by it. Is that an ADHD thing as well? I mean, I thought it was an autism thing.
yeah. I mean, we can cross over autism as well,
Yeah.
but it's demand avoidance. It's like if we're told what to do and we don't know why, we really sort of need to understand why behind everything, really, which is another good tip for yoga teachers. We're quite good with meaning and
Yep.
understanding. Then we will avoid doing it and we'll do the opposite thing.
Yeah, a bit
So
oppositional, isn't it? It's a bit. This is why there's sometimes a diagnosis of oppositional defiant when it's ADHD. Right? I'll do the fucking
yeah,
opposite if I'm told something without a good reason.
yeah,
So that
exactly.
makes sense.
But the main thing that I do with the training teachers is actually about them, and it's about ADHD yoga teachers mainly coming to me and getting them to unmask as teachers, because a lot of them are very resistant in coming forward. And I
But I
think
say what masking is because
Oh,
I need
sorry.
to
Yeah,
learn that
masking.
myself.
So, if for those who don't know what masking is, masking is so you've been wearing a mask your whole life, basically, and you might mask in certain situations. So, a bit like a chameleon would, you'll do things to suit your environment, to fit in, anything to avoid feeling different or to, just to make sure that you're part of the tribe, basically. So, you might teach yoga as a teacher and use a certain yogi voice, for instance. So for me, I was very had a big complex about my accent, so I might
You
put on
don't use the international middle class, very soft yoga voice,
no, I didn't have a yoga
Rosie.
voice, and I tried for a long time, and failed miserably, and felt exhausted. And when we mask, we feel exhausted. So as a teacher, yeah, it could be in your voice, it could be the music you play, it could be certain flows, and being afraid to sort of, you know, put a bit of creativity into your flow because it's got to be done a certain way, or you're worried that people won't like it, or whatever it might be. Um, in the real world, masking can show up in all different ways in our careers, relationships, in how we present ourselves, in everything. Masking is everywhere. And that's what causes a lot of the burnout, actually. But what I would say to, the teachers that come on my training, and what we've done, an amazing job with the first cohort, is really getting them to represent what we need. It's like everything that we see that in the industry that's for diversity or inclusion, it all starts with people representing and being seen and feeling safe, and then that filters into people, the students on the mat. And that's what I did at a recent festival, and all it was showing up as who I was and saying that I had ADHD and that I will stumble over my words, I will forget what I'm saying. And that had a profound effect, actually more than I'd ever even thought could, on the people in that room that came to my class. And that's where the real magic is. And that means I'm masking, even if you haven't got ADHD, I'm masking about who you are as a teacher is actually the most powerful thing you can do to make any environment feel accommodating and accessible, because
Nice.
it just inspires us to do the same.
Can we talk about class a little bit? So
Mhm.
when Vish is my PA, sent me your details. Said, you're going to be on, this person do a podcast swap. I think you're going to like them. And as soon as I listened to you, I was like, I like this person. They're real. They're not bullshitting. And then I also realized you're one of the few people that we've come on that has like a working class British accent. So for foreign listeners, might not know the difference, but in England, people really, but it's rare, right? Like
Mm,
people talk about diversity a lot. We've had lots of black people, gay people, all sorts. But yoga, for example, is posh as fuck.
it
It's
is, yeah.
absolutely dominated by girls called Jemima. Um, it's Now I don't know your background, but from your mannerisms and accent, I can guess is relatively working class. And it was so
Mm.
refreshing to hear that. And it's so rare. It's the one form of diversity that no one talks about, even though in the UK, I think it's the biggest one. Do you know what I mean? There's plenty of black people in the Conservative Party, but there's not many working class people. And it's yeah, so can you say a little bit about class? And as you say, it alludes to classism sometimes, like people saying you're blonde or dippy. There's a certain judgment that comes with that, right?
Yeah,
So
I think
what's been
that's
your experience of that?
a lot. I think that's probably my biggest barrier in my life. Actually, is partly the my accent and having undiagnosed ADHD, so being away, seeming like I'm away with the fairies as well. On top of that, so having that working memory. Um, and when I did my teacher training, this is why I ended up doing two. Actually, I did two full teacher trainings because I was so worried that I wasn't good enough to be a yoga teacher because I wasn't academic enough, and the way I communicated wasn't going to be good enough. And I think I think it's just definitely held me back in lots of areas of my life. And even when I worked in a corporate world, I remember one job pulling me up saying, we really like you, but when you answer the phone, do you mind putting on a different voice, please? And which I did at the time, and felt really unhappy in that environment. And it was
Mm.
actually only until I went to News UK. I worked at News UK for 4 years, the longest place I stayed, which is home of some of the most unpopular newspapers, which is the Sun and the Times. But they were all working class, and I think that's why it was the only job that I'd stayed in longer than a year, because I felt I could be myself and talk like I could, and no one judged me for it. But yeah, as a yoga teacher, it did show up. And I think I was always very scared to sort of apply for certain studios and go for auditions. Always felt really weird. So that's why I think I always did my own thing in my own area. And yeah.
I wanted to draw some attention to that because no one ever fucking talks about it. And I think in the UK it's massive. I'm sure in other countries it's a thing too. And it's for some reason, I think because it's harder to spot, maybe.
Mm,
It's not just like, are you gay or straight? It's pretty straightforward in some ways, but skin color, you can just see it on a website. Whereas this, you can't see on a website. So how are people going to know that, yeah, that yoga school has got three Asian teachers, but they all went to fee paying schools and they all come from money. That's not obvious, is it? Whereas
no.
other things are. All right. Good word I heard from you. Sparkleize. Is that a word?
Re-sparkleize.
Okay. Re-sparkleize my life, Rosie. I want to know what that is. It sounds good. It's not the same as a bejazzle, is it? A
No,
re-sparkleize. It
no, no,
sounds
no.
bad.
It's
It
not.
sounds bad.
Don't mix me out of Essex. I get called Essex quite a lot.
I wouldn't listen just because you're blonde and working class. I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't go there. How do we re-sparkleize? I like
uh,
the concept already that I don't know what it is.
So this is something that I started doing with my ADHD clients that get bored of routines, right? So we need structure. We do need a routine. We hate the word routine, but we need it. And the problem that we have is we can start them, especially exercise routines, morning routines, and we get bored and we give up. So resparkalizing is something I use with them that suggests that it doesn't have to be all or nothing thinking, that if the routine's working in some kind of way, then how can we just resparkleize it? And that means just changing one thing. So for example, my morning routine, obviously I get bored of it because I'm ADHD, but I've kept it up by changing the playlist sometimes, or mixing up what studios I might go to, or maybe I'm going to start doing weights now instead of, and do less Pilates or something, always looking at ways to resparkleize. But you can resparkleize anything. You can resparkleize your
Your
work
love life,
routine, your love
long-term
life.
relationships,
Yeah.
right?
But
It's
that, but
like
even that, resparkling your love life before it'd be right, I'm bored. I need to leave this relationship, or people think they've got to go and
look,
cheat because they're
can you
bored and
look,
it's all
honey?
wrong.
We've gone out a while. Can you just dress up as a chicken? That's all I'm
Yeah.
asking. Just respark. It's an
Can you
ADHD
just
thing. Just
resparkleize?
resparkleize it.
So
I know
that's
what
where
you
it
mean.
came from. So just little adaptations, but instead of just saying, "Oh, let's change something," I was like, "Resparkleize,
I love it. I'm stealing it. I'll credit you.
take it."
Um, okay, so we're resparkalizing. Something else I've heard you talk about, I hadn't seen before in relation to ADHD, is meaning making. So I'm fascinated in meaning making. And one way to look at ADHD is like we need things to be meaningful. If we're
Mm,
connected to passion, I've coached a lot of people around life purpose, then it's not that we can't concentrate. I think we can't not focus on things that are interesting. And equally, we have to make things meaningful and interesting, as you've talked about earlier, like a yoga teacher telling people this is why we're doing this, and it becomes meaningful. So, can you speak a little bit about that connection of meaning and ADHD?
Yeah, meaning is everything. You're right. And the more meaningful we can make something that is more positive for us, the something we want to achieve, the better. Because as I mentioned, our brains tend to be more in the negative bias, right? So we have a stronger negative bias because it is stimulating. So meaning stimulates our brain, and usually in a positive way instead of the negative way. So, to get an ADHD to move forward or progress in their life, they need to have meaning. And actually, the most successful ADHDs I've ever met have sort of figured that out in some way. And that's why they've managed to have successful relationships or a
Yep.
successful business or whatever it is that they've gone on to achieve. Meaning is everything. And every time I coach, I'm sure you do it like you said about purpose, but the first thing I do is I want to get into the meaning of why. And that can be if they've gone, oh, I want to be more organized. I've come here because I'm disorganized. In the end, that isn't about being disorganized. Their meaning we've got to is, I want to be more present with my kids or with my family. Why is that important to you? Well, because that's what life's all about. So that's where I'll go from something so surface level to finding the meaning for them, because they need that. They have to have that to move
Nice.
forward.
Yeah, I have to have a job I love. I couldn't do a job I didn't love. That's what I've worked
Yeah.
out quite quickly. I was like, this has to be a meaningful job. Listen, I know we're near the end, so you're probably bored and wanting to leave early.
I'm not
But
actually.
no, we've got 5 more minutes, Rosie. You're not going anywhere. So what are your practical tips? Someone comes to you, they're like, I need an ADHD coach. I did this, I found it very helpful. What are your like top, all right, lesson one? Here's some practical stuff for you. Maybe some of the coaches listening can pass it on.
So, number one is find why. So what we said, meaning. Why do you want what it is that you're saying you want? You know, what does that actually mean to you? What's important to you? And become aware when you're doing that if it is actually important to you, or is this still masking? So is this about, impressing other people, or because you want to fit in? Break it down, small steps. I know you want to do everything at once and you want to make it all happen at once. And that is great to have that, ambition. And we can do a lot, but we can't do it all. By taking the smaller steps, we are enabling ourselves to avoid burnout for a start, and actually, learn, enjoy it, trust the process, and be present. So I would say break stuff down, simple steps, and have fun first. ADHDers need fun. It's like, people say do the hard thing first. Not for us. We have to have fun first.
I
So,
require it. It's necessary.
yeah, it's necessary. Start in your place of strength. And, people say again, why would you start in your place of struggle when you can start in your place of strength? You're only ever going to be mediocre in your place of struggle. So, yes, being disorganized, not being great with time, attention to detail, they're all things we need. However, there are things that others might be able to help you with, or things that you could use technology for, and things that you can get by with. The things that you have as your strength cannot be bought and cannot be taught. So my advice to all my clients is please focus there, because that is how you raise the struggles anyway. The struggles get better by focusing in your area of strength. And I think that's it.
Employ Germans. Be glad that you're blonde and not ginger. Resparkleize your love life so you don't just have an affair.
Yes, re-sparkleize.
I'm going to call this one resparkalizing ADHD. I'm an ADHD enjoyer. I've enjoyed this. Last question before we tell people where to find you. So what have you've got a great podcast. It's really sharp, actually. I'm going to text you afterwards and ask you some tips, because you've got great sound. You've got
Really?
great...
Have
Yeah,
I?
it's really put together. It's
God, I
really
don't think
nicely
so.
done. He sent it to me and I was like, I thought this person was ADHD. I was expecting it to be a mess. It's sharp. It's great.
It feels like a mess behind the closed scenes.
I love it. What have you learned from that podcast? I've learned so much from this one.
Oh my
What
God,
have you
so
learned
much.
from the podcast? Give me whatever jumps out.
Oh, well, the first thing is that I should never edit podcasts. So when I first did it, I didn't turn the mic on for my first episode and spent 2 weeks editing one episode. So that's the first thing I learned. I've learned that the most important thing actually for ADHD, thriving with ADHD is love. And that is finding what you love to do for work and being around people that you love is actually the ultimate, if we can do it, you know, treatment for ADHD. That was Dr. Ned Hallowell, and he says that he's like the master of ADHD in America. And I've learned that we're not alone, and actually we don't have a deficit of attention. In fact, we have an abundance of it, and we just struggle to know where to channel it at times.
It's quite nice to talk to other ADHD. I remember when my niece realized I was ADHD, you could see she sort of lit up because it was like someone she cared about and liked was also ADHD. And
Yeah.
we call it Squirrel Club and we have jokes about it. And it's like when I talked to a couple of other business people with it, I was like, oh, this is great. Like you've had some of the same problems I've had. It's I don't want to make it too much like we're special and different, because there's a lot of things these days are just an attempt to be special and different. But this definite it is like, look how special I am with my fucking diagnosis. But there's definite things where I've gone, I'm really glad I've talked to other people with this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely. And I think actually it's the opposite of like for years you thought it was just you, and actually you realize I'm not I'm not that special, not that different, because there's a load of other people that actually are very similar to me and struggle with the same things and have similar strengths, and it makes you feel part of something. And community is everything, I think, to move forward and unmask. I think unmasking, as I say, I know I've mentioned it a lot, but I think the biggest thing I've learned is all we ever had to do, if we'd have just known, is actually be more of who we are. And I think it makes me quite tearful, actually. I think that's the thing that breaks my heart is, you know, adults that I've met, they're in their like 60s and 70s. They've spent their life masking and thinking they had to be someone else. And actually, the more we become who we are, everyone becomes happier and healthier and more fulfilled. And I just hope that the future of, the children of today and the children of the future just have a completely different story to tell when it comes to ADHD. And it's something that people want instead of don't want.
This has been great. This has been great. I look forward to hearing some of the nasty, sordid details of how bad things got back in the day before you realized this. I think we should share those offline another time.
Yeah.
I'm going to become a remasker. I don't do enough masking. So
No,
next
we
time
need more people like you, Mark.
Next time I'm being a twat, I'm going to be like, I'm unmasking. That's what I'm doing.
Well, that's it. You're unmasking.
So no, I'm with you. I think particularly like I did a thing on people pleasing, and particularly female clients. I see so much of that, and it really makes them lonely, right? It really makes them lonely because no one's meeting them. They're only meeting the mask.
Exactly. And that's the thing. Like I would say to you, it's like, what do you gain from masking, Mark?
What would I gain?
Yeah, what do you
wouldn't
gain?
be cancelled again. And
yeah.
no.
But then what about if you look at your life overall, what do you want to be remembered for?
I always say this to them. I've got friends who don't like their students because their students don't know who they are. And my students all know who I am. And if they think I'm a twat, it's for good reason. And I think, what I gain through not masking very much is people know me and I get the right students and the right listeners and all that, which I think is the big advantage to it, which
that's huge. And this is exactly what I say on my course. You find your tribe then, because otherwise you've got to keep that up.
You find your people. All right. Enough of this. This has been great. Rosie, tell us about the podcast. Where do people find you online? Coach training, plug it. Imagine you're American for the next 2 minutes and plug the shit out of yourself.
I'm going to mask. So people can find me at ADHD_untangled, which is in my Instagram. And for my yoga teacher trainings, we have our second cohort, our foundation training in February. And you have the opportunity from that to actually train as an ADHD movement coach later on in the year. And that is at untangledco.com. I think that's it. But join the movement. We need more yoga teachers with ADHD out there representing.
I don't normally agree with yoga morally, but I'm going to support this, and I definitely recommend your podcast. It is very, very good. Rosie, I knew this would be a joy, and it has been. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.